Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm Alberto Diaz-Calleros. Before turning it over to Chuck Walker, who has been our partner in arms in this, collaboration to have several, this is, I think, the fourth book presentation that we do together between Stanford and UC Davis, also with the general support of Title VI. I do want to take a minute to acknowledge the land on which we gathered, here at least in Davis and at Stanford. For thousands of years, these lands have been home of the Patwin and the Ohlone peoples. Today, in the Davis area, there are three federally recognized Patwin tribes: the Cochil de He Band of Wintun Indians of the Colusa Indian community, the Kletse Dehe Wintun Nation, and the Yosha Dehe Wintun Nation. The Ohlone peoples actually have not been able to get a federal recognition, but they're still in a legal case. So the Patwin and the Ohlone peoples have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young generations through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on these traditional lands. Over to you, Chuck.
Thanks so much, Alberto. I want to welcome everyone and thank everyone for joining us. This is the fourth in the series of book presentations. I want to acknowledge my colleagues at Stanford and San Jose State Universities. I also want to mention Sara Clemente, who's done great work from the flyer to the technical arrangements and Zoom. Our commentator today is a distinguished anthropologist and old friend of the Hemispheric Institute and also Bolivar House, Charlie Hale. He is the Dean of Social Sciences at UC Santa Barbara and Professor of Global Studies. He previously taught at UT Austin and UC Davis. He directed the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies at Austin, as well as the Lilas Benson Latin American Studies collection, and phenomenal library they have there. He was president of LASA from 2006 to 2007, and his books include Más que un Indio, Racial Ambivalence and Neoliberal Multiculturalism in Guatemala, and Resistance and Contradictions, Miskito Indians in the Nicaraguan State, both translated into Spanish. Many other publications as well. Thank you so much, Charlie, for taking time from Santa Barbara for joining us today. Stefano Varese is a beloved friend and colleague, emeritus in the Native American Studies Department, where he is still very, very active. His fascinating life, as readers of The Art of Memory will learn, took him from Italy to Peru to Mexico, and fortunately for us, to Davis, with a stopover in Stanford. His classic study, La Selva de los Cerros, has been published in numerous editions in Peru, translated to English and other languages. He's the author of many other books as well. He has received awards from LASA, Casa de las Americas, and a broad global recognition for his work with Native peoples, for the Amazon, and many other themes. I have read this book in the original Spanish version, this new wonderful English edition, and I wholeheartedly recommend it. Anyway, today we are honored to have these two speakers. We will begin with Charlie Hale and then Stefano, and then we'll have time for questions. I'd ask you send them via chat. If we can, we will open it to be direct, but there will be time for questions and comments for Stefano and for Charlie. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone.
Thanks so much, Chuck and Alberto, for the invitation to join this wonderful occasion. As Chuck mentioned, Stanford and Davis are two institutions that I have deep ties with, and needless to say, it's a great honor to have the opportunity to speak about Stefano's book, The Art of Memory. These few lines of reflection on the art of memory have been hard to write because Stefano is such a dear friend and I want to do right by him, because the topics he raises are so momentous, but also because reading the book brought me so much pleasure that I feel compelled to do my best to reciprocate. In successive evenings over the past month, I read a chapter or two while sipping mezcal, at times pausing to discuss a detail with Melissa, once even calling our friends Paola and Guille in Oaxaca to share thoughts, going to sleep with Stefano's remarkable life on my mind. A text can induce pleasure in many different ways as we marvel at the depth of an insight, feel called in by some connection to our own lives, by the sheer emotional force conveyed, and the art of memory did all this for me. But these moments of pleasure fully congeal only if the prose is well crafted. If, as I always used to tell my graduate students, if you give the language tender, loving care, and if the writer manages to lighten the load of even the weightiest topics with words that soothe, bring a smile to the reader's face, or perhaps even a quiet chuckle. There are many such passages in this book, and since I read it in English, we have to thank Margaret Randall as well as Stefano for this pleasure. I want to begin by sharing just one of these with you, a passage that also invoked my own memory of our family crossing the border from Texas into Mexico and wondering if we should hide our dog Sandy under the seat. Stefano and Linda crossing into Mexico in exile from a military coup in Peru, and the border agent asks, "Do you have any weapons?" "No," they respond. "Should we?" I chuckled. Another source of pleasure in this book is the amazing photographs. Their grainy black and white texture remind us that we are reaching deeply into a past century. The radiant beauty of an early photo of Linda seals our intuitive grasp of Stefano's love for her like no words could. The shot of the four, Stefano, Linda, and two smiling children, laying the foundation of their house in San Felipe del Agua, powerfully conveys the difficulty of the decision a few years later to leave Oaxaca. And the cover photo of Coronado and Stefano attached to our fridge for some weeks now, which beckons and provokes so powerfully that a new insight emerges each time I take it in. Following Stefano's example of an unflinchingly critical stance toward our own discipline, we cannot ignore the image's slight whiff of anthropology's colonialist past, which would become a present danger if we were not to acknowledge it fully. At the same time, in keeping with another through line in the book, Stefano's warm embrace of contradiction, the photo conveys all that I love most about ethnography. The adventure of living outside your comfort zone, the intensely mind-expanding experience of learning through cultural difference, the radicalizing potential of that commitment to live, listen, and learn with empathy. I associate all this with the book's subtitle, An Ethnographer's Journey. The title is also apt in alluding to memory work, not merely as chronological narrative, but as higher art form, allowing the text to unfold in a way that resembles how our memories actually work, as excerpts recovered from a dusty archive, some brief, others extended, in patterns suggesting that the very act of remembering and committing words to the page brings forth yet another folder in the archive, previously unopened, or perhaps too painful, too perplexing to retrieve. At its core, this book is not so much about what happened and with whom, although we could certainly read it that way with ample reward, but rather, what did that mean? Stefano asks how to make sense of each juncture, each twist and turn in my own life, and what might others learn from my reflections. As we've been taught, especially by feminist theorists, these junctures always have intimate, emotional, and spiritual dimensions, which inform the institutional, structural, and explicitly ideological. Stefano makes this insight his North Star, which requires great clarity of purpose. In this sense, though, as Lynn Stephen laments in her foreword, Stefano narrates a largely masculine institutional world. The memory arts he deploys bear little resemblance to the alpha male memoir genre, and may even be said to have a feminist aspiration. Stefano's account of his years working in the Velasco government, roughly 1970 to 75, began with a challenge to show that anthropological expertise is good for something more than classroom pedagogy. This conjured my own memories of critical engagement with the Sandinista revolutionary government's relations with Black and indigenous peoples of Nicaragua's Atlantic coast, although from a position of minor importance compared with Stefano's central role, but with a comparable, perhaps faded, conviction that anthropology could indeed rise to that challenge. More broadly, I read his account as a troubling reflection on modernity's failed promise, taking its brighter days of humanist socialism as a point of departure. I could not imagine a more eloquent illustration of Hartley's evocative phrase, "the past is a foreign country," than the scene Stefano sets in the inner sanctum of the Velasco Ministry of Agrarian Reform, gatherings of eminent Latin American intellectuals drawing exuberantly on Stafford Beer's pioneering cybernetic research to guide revolutionary transformations. And here I have to quote, rethinking the abacus of the dreams of indigenous people of the Peruvian Amazon, developing a model based on numeric simulation that would allow us to assign number values to all the variables that might intervene in the definition of a native community of the Amazon, and in determining a minimal and ideal way to recognize and deed lands. Whew. This structure of feeling, which shaped the mid and late 20th century confidence in modernity's revolutionary and liberatory potential as necessary counterpoints to modernity's horrors, this structure of feeling is gone forever. Although deeply moving to me because I also experienced it once, it would at best garner a bemused smile from the generation like our daughters. Very little discernible relation to their radical dreams. A foreign country they might agree to visit, but more out of deference than embodied desire. Yet while Stefano's full-throated renunciation of modernity's promise comes in a different context, he troubles even a fleeting affirmation of that importance, of the importance of that exuberant moment. With the help of some critical prodding from Richard Chase Smith and from his Ashanika interlocutors, he had subjected his work in the Velasco government to what he calls, quote, profound ethical questioning, long before the military put an end to what was left of his hopes for a modernist revolutionary Peru. Moreover, an even greater counterpoint to any temptation to bask in this moment of history making comes from another instance of the book's feminist aspiration. The principal motif of those heady days, alongside Velasco's revolution, was Stefano falling in love, and Linda's, to quote again, uncanny ability to heal my damaged persona, unquote. Still, the allure and aura of a Latin American humanist socialism, though battered by the military governments of the 70s, lived a few decades more, even limping into the 21st century. It was not just alive, but vibrant in the Mexico of the 1970s, making Stefano and Linda's move to Oaxaca a homecoming as much as an exile. If the visitation of Mario Vasquez in his University of San Marcos office first presented Stefano with the existential question, what is your anthropology really good for? It was Guillermo Bonfil's warm welcome and invitation to work with Culturas Populares that offered the opportunity to craft a full-fledged response. Here again, there are so many levels on which to engage Stefano's narrative, a narrative which I read as his own self-reflexive and insightful version of Así me nació la conciencia. The sparks of radicalizing influences in his otherwise petty bourgeois upbringing, his life-defining choices, the blurred lines between liberal humanism and system-challenging radical praxis, and another homecoming of sorts when he finds a welcoming space for activist anthropology, not in the anthropology department, but in the Department of Native American Studies at Davis. Through all this, Stefano trains a sharp eye on the tensions and contradictions which make any choice or stance, however legitimate, at the same time partial and compromised. One such tension has special resonance for me because it comes up constantly in my current job, an oscillation between deep admiration for rigorous, erudite, critical intellectual production on the one hand, and disdain for the apolitical refusals that this quintessential academic performance so often entails on the other. I love the anecdote of Stefano's stern French mentor, Professor Veillard, telling him, quote, "Senor Varese, stop reading about the Campa Indians. You're too influenced by the writings of others. Go where they live, learn their language, stay with them as long as you can, and come back with books of notes and photos," unquote. I also appreciated Stefano's reappraisal of Gerald Weiss. He first read Weiss as an agent of cultural imperialism, but gradually came to respect him for the sheer brilliance of his ethnography of the Ashaninka. More generally, so many of the extraordinary rewards of Stefano's life as an anthropologist rest on the foundation he laid following Veillard's wise advice, which resulted in the iconic work, La Sal de los Cerros. And yet, even before the ink on that book had dried, an optimism of the will took hold, leading Stefano to embark on a remarkable journey of political engagement, which left Veillard, Weiss, and so many others behind. These choices, this refusal to be rendered a spectator, made his life well lived, and they inspire our deepest admiration. Activist anthropology, moreover, brought Stefano to a profound, life-changing embrace of what he calls the cosmocentric lifeways that he learned from the Ashaninka and later from the Zapotec of Oaxaca. I am grateful that he narrates his growing commitment to these groundings without getting too deeply into what in current anthropological parlance is known as the ontological turn. It's not just that Stefano's introduction to this radically different way of viewing the world began decades earlier, but more fundamentally because he affirms these groundings reflexively as partial connections, rather than as Copernican paradigm shift. In making this observation, I'm speculating that Stefano's following the lead of his Ashaninka mentors, who in the struggle against noxious colonial oppressions that came with modernity, did not hesitate to appropriate its tools to advance their cause. Even if in the 21st century, the maladies of the 21st century have given cosmocentrism a somber urgency for all humanity, even if it takes on much greater importance in Stefano's later years, the image that his lifelong narrative conveys to me is one of partial connections all the way down. Granted, there are moments when it appears to be otherwise. When the fox appears to bid Chaparro farewell, when Pochano accompanies him as a woodpecker, when he emerges shaken and transformed from a 9-day meditation fast, when he reflects on insights gained from an arduous 2 days with the plant teacher. At these moments, I fancy hearing his faint plea to Maestro Gramsci, "Could you please release me from what he calls, quote, the dialectic of my emotions," unquote. To which the maestro responds with a gentle, "No, Senor Varese, better to learn to live with those contradictions." Stefano carries us more powerfully, and in my use of the pronoun here, us, I refer to those of us who did not grow up with access to cosmocentric ways of being and knowing. He carries us more powerfully there because his thought process is so dialectical, so full of contradictory twists and turns, with increasing clarity and conviction, but no definitive arrival. I associate Stefano's journey toward a deepening affirmation of cosmocentrismo with his astounding capacity to find fortitude in vulnerability. I have no explanation for this intuition beyond noting the inner peace that cosmocentrismo seems to bring him, combined with the sense that we need firm alternative groundings to resist the assumption that to reveal existential crises, painful episodes, ill-considered decisions, emotional turmoil, ethical uncertainties, and the like, to reveal all this is a sign of weakness best kept away from public view. The critique of toxic masculinities, a central motif of current times, begins here. with the inability of our society, and especially of men, to break down these protective walls, to do precisely what Stefano has shown us is possible. I'm still taking it all in, not quite sure where to start, but in awe of the raw courage and depth of feeling that these passages in his narrative embody. This in turn brings me to conclude with an expression of immense gratitude. Reading this book reminded me of Stefano's deeply formative influence in 5 moments of my life, the first before we met, and the last still in the future. One of Stefano's early forays to advance a politically committed anthropology brought him into a fierce debate with a headstrong British anthropologist named David Maybury Lewis. Surely this debate helped to soften Maybury Lewis up to be a more sympathetic reader a decade later of the activist inclinations of my senior honors thesis. In the early 1980s, we organized to bring Stefano to Stanford to affirm the aspirations of our cohort to contest the apolitical groundings of our graduate training. Imagine being taught by a signatory of the iconic Declaración de Barbados. At Davis in the 1990s, Stefano, Linda, Andre, Carol, and Rachel became our posse, and Stefano mentored my transition from revolutionary Nicaragua to neoliberal academia. In the early 2000s, a visit with Stefano and Linda in Oaxaca sowed the seeds of our engagement there, and Stefano gave us gentle encouragement with his signature, warm and self-reflexive humor to partake in La Reforma Agraria Postmoderna. Finally, reading and reflecting on this book marks the beginnings of a 5th moment of influence and deep gratitude for the lessons that, as they gradually manifest, will once again be life-changing. Always choose what is right over what is comfortable or conventional. Embrace and learn from the contradictions. Give clear through the joy to the hurt. Confront the pain and find strength in telling difficult truths alongside the uplifting and pleasurable ones. And always remain attentive as Stefano closes this wonderful book. Always remain attentive to the whisperings of the universe. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Now we'll count on the presentation by Stefano himself. Adelante, Stefano.
My goodness, Charlie, what a wonderful reading of my life. I still remember so clearly when you pushed me to come to Stanford, and you forced me to manifest myself as an ideal socialist to be and to want it to be before a crowd of graduate students and faculty sometimes, hypercritical most of the time, but some of them became very good friend of mine. And that was a key moment of my life in California. You really opened the door of the wonderful side of the US culture and US history, the side that is linked to the tradition of liberation or looking for a better future. That is always part of this society, even if it's hidden behind all sorts of materialist and individualistic aspect. Your commentary are absolutely brilliant and fantastic, and so deep that forced me to reread what I wrote and maybe attempt to translate it into a language that can be understood by postmodern younger people. What can I say? My life has been divided in quarters, practically, or periods that have defined the totality of my life. Italy, my Italian upbringing, the fact that I was abandoned by my father and I didn't realize how important it was to have a father figure in my life when I was a kid. The rediscovery and the search for that father figure when I decided to migrate, to go to Peru to look for my father. Then the period of Peru that redefined me as initially as a Peruvian, later as a Latin American, and finally as an American, Hemispheric American, as I transit to Mexico and later to the US. But the defining period of my life in Italy was also the fact that I grew up in the post-fascist Italy, post-war Italy, and in Italy that was searching very deeply for the establishment of a new kind of democracy after more than 20 years of fascism under Mussolini and later the war, 5 years of war. And Italy that was looking for a new kind of democracy that was interrupted by the pressure of at that time, England and the United States to moderate the willing to establish a socialist democracy. At that time, I remember the attempted murder of the secretary of the Communist Party, Palmiro Togliatti. I was a kid of 8 years of age. I remember the general strike, the response of the government, the military occupation of the city where I was living, Turin. And I made sense of all of that. Finally deciding that there were two sides of this story. The fascist and conservative side and the progressive and socialist side. And that the world was divided into, my vision of the world was that these two camps were fighting each other and contradicting each other. And maybe I had an intuition with the help of my sister Gigliola, who was a very enlightened young woman, an intuition that it was possible to combine the two opposite trends, contradicting aspects of life and social life into a formula that would honor the humanistic tradition of that part of Europe. A formula that would allow the expression of this opposite side into a new, dialectically new synthesis. And that is the idea or a series of ideas that I brought with me, not clearly expressed, not clearly stated, but that I brought with me to Peru. And there, the transformation occurred when I, as a very young student, undergraduate student, I ended up visiting an hacienda of the church in the region of Cusco, where poverty and oppression of the indigenous people was so obvious, so evident, that transformed completely my kind of exotic view of Peru as a place where beautiful indigenous people were living in this majestic environment of the Andes, into the realization of the oppressive system, the deeply colonial system that was exploiting these people, even in the hands of the church, because the hacienda was run by the church, was by the Catholic priest. So that is the beginning of my emergent consciousness, Americanized consciousness of, is it possible to search and fight for a more just society that respects all position, all opinion, and establish an harmonious way of coexistence, and in search of a betterment of life. And so that is what took me to become more active in my anthropology. But that is well described, and Charlie did an excellent job in retracing that. When I was not only invited, but forced to accept my participation in the Velasco Revolution, working on the idea of restoring the territoriality, the territories of the indigenous people of the Amazon, and return to them the right to own a large or larger piece of territory with all with everything on those territories, the river, the waters, the underground, the sky, everything that belongs to them, their animal, etc. I spent 4 years working very hard on that, and we were able to enact partially a law that would protect the land and the goods of the indigenous people of the Amazon. That law was passed by the revolutionary government of Velasco, and finally dismantled completely, and now is almost a parody of what it used to be. But in spite of that, the indigenous people of the Amazon have been able to recuperate larger portion of their original territory, sometimes fragmented in small community land, other time more extended and articulated territories. And that ended my life in Peru with a self-exile, an exile that was a strong invitation to leave the country by the military government that took over the Velasco revolution and destroy all the hopes that we had built in 7 years of Velasco revolution. And that is what brought me and Linda and my dog Oregon at the time, first to California for a short period of time, and later to Mexico and Oaxaca. And there started what Charlie described very, very well in the very short presentation of my activity in Culturas Populares, that I treat in the book with a deep respect for all the Mexican people that created that space. Guillermo Bonfil, Rodolfo Stavenhagen, Leonel Duran, all anthropologists and social scientists of an incredible intellectual caliber, but also of an incredible emotional caliber. People that thought not only with their brain, their mind, but with their heart, their sonjo, as they would say in Cusco, or the chulel of the Maya people of Chiapas. The thought that comes out of the heart, of the soul, ideas that are generated in the emotional part of our being. So that was a wonderful period of my life, our life with Linda. we fell in love with Oaxaca, we fell in love with the people of Oaxaca, the art, the beauty of the people, the beauty of the craft that the people work with, produce, the arts. Oaxaca is a place of artists, a place of musicians, a place of poets, and all of them deeply rooted into the Mesoamerican indigenous tradition, all of them familiar with multiple languages. They can hear, even if they don't understand, dozens of languages spoken that relate to an old past of 15, 16, 17,000 years of ages. Oaxaca, the core place of domestication of corn and beans and aguacates and squash, etc. From where comes a beautiful cuisine, also combining this traditional native plants in beautiful flavor with the influence of the rest of the world, especially Spain and Europe. So those were years of beauty and year of opportunity. It was also years where we raised our 2 children and eventually even our grandchild, who just passed away tragically a few months ago. Our only grandchild, Isabella. And then our decision to come to the state, especially to take care of Andre, my wonderful son, now adult, who had a kind of genetic predisposition to isolate himself through language. So our arrival to California also marked the final part of my personal life, although I think I will keep returning to Oaxaca over and over again. And the adaptation of my human being, my being, to what in my youth I considered the heart of corrupted capitalism and the heart of imperialism. How can I end up living in what for years I was criticizing so severely as the origin of most of the evil that I knew and that were spreading around in the world? And here I have to say that, starting with the anecdote that I tell in the book, when I met Herbert Marcuse in a house in San Jose, together with Bettina Aptheker, Angela Davis, and the friend and teacher of Linda, David Newman, a psychologist. I met the leftist side of the North American US culture, a deeply rooted, critical, socially critical side of this culture. So here I am in the heart of imperialism, but at the same time, I am accompanied by the best tradition of socialist thoughts and ideas and ideals. And so that was finally complemented by the discovery that the native people of this part of the world, the indigenous people, the native people, are still here, are still present. They are still marking deeply the culture of this society, either by their absence in the general view of the North American people, of the US citizen, but also their presence in the deeply rooted spiritual culture of this country, the respect for the environment, I wouldn't say, I can say that part of the movement on environmental justice that is rooted, that is expressed in this country and in Europe, is implicitly recognizing the deep importance of the native people view of the world that has been kept alive in the native community, in the native intellectual, in the native artists, painters, poets, writers, intellectual, and that has been finally found an expression among young people in the environmental justice movement that we are witnessing today. So this encounter finally of myself with the Native American people took place through the the knowledge, the acquaintance of two wonderful persons, Dave Riesling, who was at that time a professor in Native American Studies in the program of Native American Studies at Davis, and Jack Forbes, who was then the chair of the Department of Native American Studies. They both, especially Dave Riesling, invited me to come to Davis. And I owe to him and to Jack Forbes and to Sarah Hutchinson at that time the honor to have been invited into a Native American department as a white person of Genoese origin. Don't forget that I was born in Genoa, the infamous birthplace of Christopher Columbus, and nevertheless, I became the only non-indigenous member of a department of Native American Studies at that time, 20 years ago. So that is more or less a very superficial overview of my long life. I don't know what else I could add to the beautiful words of Charlie. I will print out those words and post them in front of my desk so that I can reread them and reward myself with those words. I thought that maybe I thought at a certain time that I should read some part, but I think it's would be excessive. I think that at this point, I would open the platform, so to call, to answer few questions, if there are some questions, and open a dialogue between all of us.
Thank you so much for that, Stefano. And again, thank you, Charlie. We have over 75 people following us on Zoom and live stream. So I want to remind people, we're talking about Stefano's The Art of Memory, an ethnographer's journey. I want to acknowledge three people who were absolutely fundamental in its publication. Margaret Randall, the great activist, writer, thinker, did a phenomenal job of the translation. It's a beautifully readable prose. She engaged with Stefano's life and his own writing. I also know behind the scenes in A Contracorriente, a wonderfully independent press, Greg Dawes from North Carolina State and Carlos Aguirre at University of Oregon worked hard to get this into fruition, see it. There will be, so this is, again, The Art of Memory with A Contracorriente, sold by University of North Carolina Press. There will be a new Spanish edition in Random House, Peru, later this year. So Stefano, we have a series of questions. I'm going to start reading them to you and for you to ponder, okay? Does that work?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. The first one is from our mutual friend, Steve Brush. Thank you, Stefano, for the most interesting book, for the opportunity to revisit Peruvian experience in the 1960s and 70s. You were able to begin and carry out your work in the Peruvian Amazon, a period of openness and hospitality by the peoples of the Amazon towards outsiders like yourself. Notebook in hand, endless questions on your lips. I'm wondering if you were a naive student today, like yourself in 1964, whether you would still be met with the same openness and hospitality. Can you please reflect on the changes that have occurred in the field, quote unquote, that still exists and how to confront it? Thank you. Thanks so much, Steve. And if others have questions, you can use chat or question answer, and I will relay them to Stefano.
So I'm supposed to answer, Charlie?
Yes.
Steve, very good question. Actually, I should clarify that when I decided to go to the Gran Pajonal, the decision was already implicitly skipping the idea of going to more to area that had been already colonized much more effectively, area of the Ashanika. So I decided to leave the Pyrenees area. The Ashanika there had been colonized with intensity for the last 50 years at least. They had organized a union to defend themselves because they were working for cafetaleros locally. One of the first union of Peru, actually, one of the first agrarian union of Peru was founded by the Ashanika, not the coastal people, nor the Andean people, but the Ashanika. So I decided to go to the Pajonal because it was very difficult and very isolated, very difficult to reach. And then I was received with the innocence, so to say, of people that hadn't experienced tremendous colonial oppression. So now, everywhere in Peru, indigenous people have a hard time to receive young people, young, naive people, without doubting that these young, naive people have some second intention in approaching them. So I think that things have changed very, very much, very drastically, even in the Pajonal. Pajonal has been open to all sorts of corporations. They are starting mining projects. So those Ashanika now know exactly what a foreigner means to them. A foreigner, even if it's a dark-skinned Limeña, is still a foreigner. It's still either a Chori or a Kirinka for an Ashanika, and he brings only Kametsa. I mean, Hamiri, only bad things. So that is a very superficial answer, but to that question.
That's great. We have a saludo, if you will, and then a question for you, a request, I should say. Marisol de la Cadena says, gracias, Charlie. Un homenaje, una vía de amistad, dare I say, feminist friendship, que reverberates beyond the two of you. I'm very happy to skip time from prepping for my lecture in 30 minutes. Now I have to go. Gracias, Charlie, a Stefano, and timeless cosmopolitical citizens de la vida. That's from Marisol de la Cadena. And then William Durham asks, wonderful presentations, both Charlie and Stefano. I wonder if Stefano has a favorite paragraph or two in his book that he would be willing to read and share with all of us in the audience. That would be a special treat, and I absolutely agree with this. Could you select a paragraph or two, Stefano?
Oh my goodness. Okay, maybe one of the final paragraphs, let's say. The chapter 40 is called Cosmic Dialogues. And it starts, I skip a few lines. Errors imprison us in our pride. My pilgrimage between the material and the spiritual, the secular and sacred, was marked by small insinuations, allusions, diminutive epiphanies, revelation, and a few brief encounters with the unknown and inexplicable, which, when woven into an integrated vision, make up the symbolic cloth of the hammock of my life. I find myself now in these twilight years, living and resting, reflecting and imagining space and time in a network of unrelated and non-causal events that speak of mystery more than algorithms, and that convoke my emotional intelligence more than my Cartesian logos. And from there I go and conclude my book with a few other words about my idea that instead of an anthropocentric position, intellectual position, I have adopted what the indigenous people of the Amazon had taught me, a more cosmocentric position, where there is no center, but we are of the cosmos. We belong to the cosmos with all the other entities, physical, biophysical, biological entity, from the viruses that attack us to the bacteria that help us or attack us, to the animal, to the plant, to the air, to the water, etc. So that is at the end of the book, kind of philosophical, ethical speculation.
Wonderful. We have more questions coming in. I want to let people know that the procedure, we normally, I mean, many of you I know have things to do at 1 o'clock, some get off, but we do linger a bit more. And certainly with the line of questions we're getting, we'll stay on longer. But we know people have things to do, places to go. So some will leave at 1 and some maybe will join us. So the next question is from Carolina Camandulli. Dear Stefano, thank you much. I hugely admire your work. Could you tell us a bit more about your work research in Cerro de la Sal? Do you see any chance of this place being returned to the indigenous people of the region?
Hi, Carolina. It's so nice that you're here with us. I am working very hard on that. That's a dream that I actually started to develop when I read your dissertation, Carolina. For participants in this meeting, Carolina has been working very beautifully and hard with the Ashaninka that are on the Brazilian side. The Ashaninka that were sort of deported from Peru, from the Pyrenees area, all the way to that area of during the Caucho boom, the terrible period of the life of the indigenous people in the Amazon. So Carolina did a fantastic job with her dissertation, which is not published yet. Must be published very urgently. The dream that I have is based on reading again and learning that the Ashaninka of Brazil are really extremely connected with the Ashaninka of Peru, separated by hundreds of miles and years of distance. They are still considering the central jungle of Peru, La Selva Central, as their original territory. And so, and in that territory, there is El Cerro de la Sal that is still vulnerable to exploitation and occupation by foreigners. And especially, there was an attempt by a Japanese company a long time ago, but also a national company, to exploit the salt of this huge mountain of salt for industrial purposes. So what occurred to me is that it would be a fantastic contribution of the Peruvian society, the Latin American society, the people of goodwill, to establish a national, I don't know how to call it, a national monument or a national territory dedicated to the history of the Ashaninka and to the current Ashaninka people, creating a park and a reserve of the Cerro de la Sal, so that even with manifestation of and presence of Ashaninka living there as an untouchable area dedicated to the history, the millennial history of the Ashaninka and their millennial presence in that area of the central Amazon of Peru and Brazil now. of the Central Amazon in general. So that is my dream. And I have been mobilizing a few friends and colleagues that are connected politically in Peru, because this would require a presidential decree, all the bureaucratic BS that is required in this case, to declare that a national monument and reserve that territory, the large territory, and the entire cerro, the entire mountain, to the Ashaninka people. So that is a sort of short answer to Carolina.
That's great. We're fingers crossed for the project. So now a question from Peru in Spanish. Juan Ferrer asks, en Perú, la historia general mira con mucha benevolencia al legado del presidente Belaúnde. Casi por casualidad encontré un extracto del profesor Varese que relata el genocidio Matsé. ¿Cuál es el rol de un científico social en pro de la justicia y la memoria? Muchas gracias por su servicio, profesor Varese. Again, Juan Ferrer, muchas gracias de Perú.
Chuck, do you think I should answer in Spanish or in
Spanish or Italian?
Juan Ferrer, yo escribí sobre el genocidio de los matsés en la revista Amaru, que dirigía en ese momento el gran poeta Westphalen. Ese artículo fue vuelto a publicar un par de veces más en otros lugares. Lo que ocurrió fue un desastre. Belaúnde, no hay que olvidarse que Belaúnde es de descendencia colonial directa, porque uno de sus ancestros fue un conquistador que llegó a Arequipa. Belaúnde tuvo una visión muy colonial de la selva en general. Su propia obra, La conquista del Perú por lo peruano, yo pregunto en uno de mis escritos, ¿quiénes son los peruanos que hay que conquistar? ¿Y quiénes son los peruanos que conquistan? Indica claramente que tenía como visión del territorio Belaúnde. Y eso lo expresó claramente cuando los madereros invadieron el territorio matsés. En esa época se llamaba Mayoruna, y hubo un par de confrontaciones violentas entre los Mayoruna, los matsés y los mestizos ribereños. Y entonces Belaúnde ordenó a la FAP, a la Fuerza Aérea Peruana en esa época, de bombardear a las aldeas matsés. Y fueron bombardeos muy serios y muy... La historia es mucho más complicada, pero en fin, yo y Linda tuvimos la suerte de visitar uno de esos clanes matsés que están en el lado peruano, pero muy cerca de la frontera con Brasil. Y vivimos allí un tiempo y nos explicó una viejita, me explicó a mí en un castellano muy, muy rudimentario, una viejita que había sido adoptada o raptada, dirían los peruanos, por los matsés y criada casi como una reina, una princesa muy, muy mimada por la comunidad matsés. Hablaba castellano y entonces me contó directamente qué pasó cuando llegaron los bombardeos, tiraron bombas incendiarias, etcétera, y los matsés tuvieron que adaptarse. Eso explica mucho sobre los matsés, explica muchísimo más sobre la violencia colonial de Belaúnde y del gobierno peruano en esa época y de los siguientes gobiernos peruanos que siempre han mirado a la selva como un territorio de conquista. Ocupación, destrucción, saqueo y ahora extractivismo. Y eso es común en Ecuador, es común incluso bajo el régimen supuestamente progresista de Correa, en Bolivia, incluso bajo el régimen supuestamente progresista de Evo Morales, en Perú siempre, con todos los neoliberales que nos siguen torturando, y en Colombia también, etc. La idea de que esta vasta región, Brasil es el mejor ejemplo, es una región que sirve solo para extraer cosas con violencia, si hace falta con bombardeos, si hace falta con matanza, con genocidios, implícito, explícito. Entonces, esa es la historia de lo que ocurrió en ese. Está escrito, está registrado en la historia, lo he escrito varias veces, lo retomo de vez en cuando, porque es un momento clave para la definición de qué ha sido el Perú en relación a los pueblos de la selva y a la Amazonía en general. Adelante.
Excellent. We have un saludo de Nilo Cayuqueo. Excelente, Charlie Stefano. Abrazos de territorio Mapuche in Argentina. And then we have a question from Miguel Novoa. We'll have maybe, if people have one or two more questions, we will end about 1:15. And I know some people are dropping off. Hi, Stefano. This is from Miguel Novoa. The history of the Amazon and its indigenous people often reads to me like a narrative of small victories against insurmountable odds and continuous losses. Is there protection only possible through the creation of reserves? Is there any way to integrate, quote unquote, their existence to the interest of the capitalist state, or is this an idealized but not practical visions?
Oh, that's a very difficult question to answer in a few seconds. I think that we have a couple of very good examples of integration, and I would use quotation mark for the word integration. In the case of Sarayaco, the Quichua community of the Bobonasa River in Ecuador. Sarayaco is a very interesting story to tell us, which begin with their decision to get rid of oil exploitation through initially semi-violent form of resistance, making it difficult for the exploration, the company that was starting the exploration, which was an Ecuadorian company together with a European oil company, and then decided that the best way to fight that would be the legal way. And they won a case, a very famous case, a few years ago, against the Ecuadorian government in the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. They won a case. The state has to pay the damages that they had caused by entering without permission of the community and started the oil exploitation. And they receive a certain amount of money that they put to work into reorganize their communities. There are 7 communities centered around the main community called Sarayaco. Reorganized, they were given the large tract of their own territory, historical territory, more than 17,000 hectares, huge amount of land of primary forest. They are creating what they call La Frontera de Flores. They are surrounding the entire territory with flowering plant tree that are in the Amazon, 18 or more plants that have flower throughout the year of different color, so that they, in 30 years from now, they argue that from the satellite picture image, we will be able to see the entire territory surrounded by flowery trees with flower of different color. And they are managing their territory with their own traditional principle of how to maintain biodiversity and use the forest in a productive way without destroying the forest, but reproducing the forest. So a wonderful example. They have internet. They don't have electricity provided from the outside. They generate electricity with the solar panel. They have bought 1 airplane. They have pilots that speak Quechua, Spanish, and English, and are pilots of their own airplane. You cannot access the community, but only with their permission through the river, or there is no road, or through their own airplane. And you have to have a permission. Even the president of the Republic of Ecuador, Correa, had to ask permission to land on their land. So it's a wonderful example of new gain autonomy. and they are managing that autonomy with brilliance, with brilliance. Everybody is involved in it, and every child knows exactly what they are defending. Every child is educated in Kitra, as they say there, and in the tradition of the society, but also in modernity, because they know very well the danger of accepting modernity without any discrimination or selection. So that is a wonderful example that I keep citing as a success story. So that is integration, but integration without being assimilated, but integration on equal standing. And that is possible and has been experienced in other areas of the Americas. So this is only a very partial and superficial answer to a very deep and profound question, because it's the question that we have to ask, and we are asking ourselves constantly every day. Is it possible the existence of cultural diversity and historical trends that are so different, and historical and teleology that are so different? Where are we aiming at? What is our future? And there are so many possibilities, and the future is being designed and is being implemented as we speak. So that is something that we have to think very seriously, not only about indigenous people, but about every other individual society, every other community that exists in the world today. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Stefano. I'm gonna send us Patricia Erickson writes, "It's so wonderful to see you and hear your voice, dear Stefano. My question is, what good trouble are you up to now, or are you planning?" I think that's you could take that on the side, but I'm going to leave. I know Alberto has what probably is our final question. Take it away, Alberto.
Oh, thank you for this wonderful opportunity to listen to both of you. I was reading your book until, chapter 20, so I didn't get past half of the book by now. But one of the things that's striking is this reminiscence you have of your Italian, or I should say your Torinese years. You're growing up. There's a beautiful picture of you growing up in this bookstore with your grandfather. So I was wondering, how would the book have been different had you not been a Torinese, had you not been kind of plunged away from your origin, but still so grounded in it? Or even you mentioned that you might have wanted to write it in Italian. How would the book have been different if you had done that?
Oh my goodness. Who Alberto is this? I thought it was Alberto Chiri, but it's not, right?
Oh, no, this is Alberto Diaz-Calleros at Stanford.
Alberto, okay. Italian played as my maternal language, my real maternal language, has played a very important role in my life. I read a lot in Italian, even when I was in Peru, because my mother was working in the library, her library, the library of my grandfather. She was able to send me books and books and books, in Italian. And when I wanted to read something in English, I wasn't that familiar with English. I would ask my mother, is there a translation of Noam Chomsky? And she said, oh yeah, I found Noam Chomsky in Italian. So she would send me Noam Chomsky. So I read Noam Chomsky in Italian. I read Herbert Marcuse in Italian and so on. So language, Italian language was very important until even now. If I even was able to write a couple of poems in Italian. And then I translated that poem in English, and I translated that poem in Spanish. And so now I have a 3-language poem. So your answer really addresses an issue that is very common I think is common in many authors, that writing and thinking in a language defines very much your worldview. and the way in which you express your feelings, your ideas. So to express ideas in Italian is slightly different than expressing your ideas in Spanish, although Italian and Spanish are very close together as language, and expressing your idea in English a little bit further separate from Italian, or expressing your idea in Russian. You remember Nabokov's famous dictum, speak English is like speaking, is a language like a lemon, and Russian is a language like an orange. No? The idea that is a full language like an orange, and English is a more reduced language like a lemon. You have to almost close your lips to pronounce it. So each language has a different kind of power to express idea. So when I was starting to write a book, and I had to acknowledge that it was my wife, Linda, who insisted, you have to write about your life because it's so full of different things. Why don't you write about? And so I accepted finally that challenge. And I sat down, I said, well, maybe I should start writing Italian. But then I said, no, because Italian is just the beginning of my emotional and intellectual life. Spanish became the second language, second native language, should I say. And finally, I had to transfer to English for academic reasons. And so I've been living in this trilingual situation for some time now. But I have no clear answer to your question. But obviously, the influence of Torino, my friends, my school years, my few young girls that I met at that time, the street of Torino, the beauty of a city, because it's a very noble city, Torino, is also combined the working class of the Fiat, the factory Fiat, the car factory, and the aristocracy, because it was the seat of the royal family. The Savoia family were from Piemonte, from the area, from Torino. So a combine of aristocracy, royalty, and working class. Torino was also a stronghold of the Communist Party for a long time. So it's a very intriguing city in a sense.
Well, I think we will end here. I want to encourage everyone to read The Art of Memory. I have some final observations. A book I just absolutely adore. First of all, every reader will find like a great memoir elements they love. Something we barely brought up here. Lima in these years and the adaptation of Peru. These are years 50s, 60s, 70s. We don't have a lot of writing about. They're just remarkably important. His remembering his house. The Velasco government, his incursions, his exploration of the Amazon is phenomenal. I think I'd say the same for, you learn a lot about Davis, you learn about Oaxaca, you learn about Italy and much more. Two final observations. A student brought this up to me. A student read this and said, it's amazing he's been, and I'm quoting her words almost roughly, said, he's such an amazing activist. He's done so much, but he reads so much. He's so erudite. I'm very impressed you use that word. There's so much thinking going into this. I think this is a good question to raise with students about these memoirs. About activism does not mean you stop reading books and vice versa. And finally, I mean, like all great memoirs, we just get to know the human, the deeply human person Stefano is. And I want to end by thanking him for being here today, but thanking him for this book and so much more that he's given to us. We've had a wonderful crowd. I just went through the participants. I really want to thank everyone for taking time today. I know, we will soon, COVID will allow us to go out and meet. I know many Davis friends, Barrier friends, read the book. And then when we are able to go out, take Stefano out, have a nice glass of wine and enjoy some of the passages and chatting with him. So again, I want to thank my friends at Stanford and San Jose State. I want to thank Sara, who did such a great job on this. And I want to, again, mention the team from A Contracorriente, Margaret Randall, the translator, Greg Dawes, Carlos Sierra, and many others who made this work in English possible. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Stefano, and everyone be well.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.